called Vance.
And who might you be?
That's cool. I want to make it. And I just so happen to be lucky enough that Skullforge Studios is releasing a Cad Bane miniature. Nowhere had Cobb Vanth, so I jumped over to Desktop Hero and threw together a rough design, kind of copying the best that I could with all the free bits and pieces. If you're willing to pay, you can make some better options, and there are some other sites out there. But this one does a pretty good job with some basic bits and allows you to adjust the skeleton before downloading a free STL. For all the extra bits, I'm going to jump over to Thingiverse and I'll grab this blaster to start with, and I'll scale it down to be about the right size. Using the rotation and movement tools, I'll line this up to blend with the side of Cobb Vanth's leg before bringing in a few little pouches. Referring back to a reference image every now and again to make sure the placement is correct, before saving the entire thing as its own STL and re-importing it back into Chitterbox. Now, to make sure that it all scales correctly with these Cad Bane miniatures, before making a few extra copies and scaling them down to about 50%. Then I added the supports and exported these models for 3D printing, before adding a few even smaller versions of the miniatures and a handful of accessories for my dioramas. Once all of these were rendered out, I took them over to my resin 3D printer and set them on print.
3 hours later.
And after our wait, we are rewarded with some fresh miniatures. They just need a little bit of a cleanup and a cure before they're ready for some little tweaks. The model had these weird edges around the sleeves, so I got out my Dremel and trimmed these away. It's a little bit easier to trim this stuff back before you cure the UV resin. Now that my models were ready, I hit them with a grey primer, followed by a zenithal highlight in a wraithbone white. Coming in with a speed paint for these guys, I really relied heavily on the contrast paints by Citadel, using the Gore Grunt of Fur, the Flesh Shade, Cygor Brown, and the Contrast Black, before using a little bit of Nuln Oil on the hair and some Lead Belcher to add in the metallic parts. Then moving over to Cad Bane with a Talasar Blue for his skin, and then coming in with the same combinations of browns and blacks over his armor, before adding in some Lead Belcher to highlight all of the silver and metallic areas. And then coming in with a little dot of Mephiston red for his eyes. Once we are done with all the last few details on this guy, we are done with these bigger models, and it's time to move on to the little stuff. We're going to prime everything in the same Fiddly Bits grey that I use across most of my models, and then coat everything in a Wraithbone white from Citadel. I'm definitely going to be relying on the contrast paints for these tiny minis. For the extra tiny miniatures, I used a little bit of blue tack and stuck them to a piece of balsa wood. This would just help to hold it while I gave them the paint job. Again, relying on these contrast paints for these tiny miniatures, we're going to do the basic shirt in a Gore Grunt of Fur, and then I came in with a Cygor Brown, covering up the miniature in a few different combinations of these browns, and then adding a flesh shade to the fingers and face. Before moving on to the even smaller miniature, I started with the flesh shade as I already had it on my brush, and then moved on to those same browns that I'd used for the larger sizes. On these very small miniatures, this contrast paint definitely does most of the work for me. And that's where I decided was the smallest I was going to paint. I did have a smaller miniature for each of these, but decided against it as I was running out of time and effort. So I quickly moved over and batch painted the two smaller Cad Banes again following the same colours that I had used on the larger model. These tiny little models are a bit of a pain in the ass, but in the end it was a good fun experiment, and I got to try out something a little bit different than anything I've worked with in the past. Especially adding these tiny little eyes. So after adding the last few details and metallic bits onto the Cad Bane miniatures, it was time to move on to the dioramas themselves. So I got some water and decided to mix up some grout. I'd never done this before and I had way too much water. So I tried again. I put some grout into a cup and added a little bit of water. Upon stirring, I realized I still needed more grout. So I added a whole heap more in, threw some PVA glue in there to help everything stick, and stirred it up till I had a nice texture. Before smearing this all over a piece of wood that I pulled out of an old photo frame from a previous build, and a small cork coaster. Then allowing it all to sit and dry. Once it was dry, I added a bit of PVA glue to the top, spread it out evenly over the entire model, and added another layer of the grout. Using grout rather than sand helps to keep the scale more appropriate, as regular sand is far too big at this scale. Once that had dried out, I came in with a Tamiya light sand spray paint and coated the entire base of both models. The smaller model also got a fairly heavy coat in the Wraithbone white before coming back in with the light sand. Ultimately, I think this made for a better desert look. And now it was time to paint up all of my little accessories. I coated a heap of these white bits and pieces in a Nuln oil and used this bluish grey contrast paint to highlight some of the extra greeblies, before coming in with a Gore-Grunter fur over the bantha. Now to test my placement. I grabbed all my bits and pieces and started having a play with how I wanted to lay them out on the display boards that I'd created. Once I was happy with the basic layout, I got to gluing everything down. And finally giving a black border to this smaller piece. I'm pretty happy with that piece, so it's time to drop down to a smaller scale on a bigger display. Again, laying everything out in a dry fit before I glue anything down to make sure that everything's gonna fit where I want it to sit. Then busting out the super glue and sticking everything down. These buildings had a spray paint of the light sand as well as an Agrax Earth Shade wash. Once all of these boardwalks have been glued down, it's time to add some moisture evaporators, a couple of boxes, some bits and pieces of extras like a land speeder and some tanks to hold whatever moisture they can collect out here, and finally gluing in the bantha.
Like a bantha.
I then added a couple more moisture evaporators to the front corners of the diorama to balance out the board a little bit. And then adding in my characters. I came in with a few texture paints to try and blend these buildings and moisture evaporators into the sandy area a little bit more, and then gave it all a bit of a dry brush to blend together. This darkened up the sand too much, so off camera I also dry brushed the entire base with a Ushabti bone to bring that really bright highlight back into the sand. And now to give you an idea of scale, this is a regular 32mm miniature next to the smaller print that I have done here. And remember, this wasn't even the smallest one. And placing the regular 32mm next to these guys, you really see how small it is. But for the rest of you that don't understand this, here is a pen for scale. This was a fun experiment outside of my regular miniature building that generally stays in the D&D 28mm and wargaming scales. So moving into these tiny scale dioramas was definitely a bit of a challenge. They aren't perfect by any means, but I had a lot of fun making them, and they'll have a nice space on my shelf.